Welcome to the Parliament of the World's Religions. It is Friday, October 16th, and this session goes from 8:30 to 10. It's called Protecting Sacred Spaces, Church, Mosque, and Temple. With the recent burning of black churches in the USA, allegedly by right-wing extremists, the protection of sacred spaces received new attention. 3 years previous, 6 people were murdered by a white supremacist in his attack on a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. At least 125 mosques, churches, and temples have come under attack just in the USA in the last 5 years. Ambassador Samantha Power, U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, states that almost all of the mosques in the Central African Republic have been wiped out. Conversely, in India, Egypt, and Nigeria, churches come under regular attack. In many instances, people of faith have come forward with a loving hand to protect and rebuild. This panel will discuss the facts, the success stories, and how faith communities can be establish loving relationships to counter the rising hate. Molly, do you want to come up here? Okay. We have with us today Pardeep Singh Kaleka. Pardeep is the eldest son of Salwant Singh Kaleka, the president of the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, who was gunned down during the attacks of August 5th, 2012. Pardeep grew up in Milwaukee and graduated from Marquette University. Being a former Milwaukee police officer and a current teacher in the inner city, Pardeep is no stranger to the never-ending battle against racism, bigotry, and ignorance. He firmly believes that the lamp of knowledge and truth will outshine all the darkness in the world, and does his best to profess this through his work with Serve to Unite. It is my great pleasure to introduce Pardeep and what he has to say to us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. These things are always tricky, huh? Good morning. I'm going to start off. With a spoken word, actually, and if I could get a little bit of help with the projector, and turn that on real quick. Thank you, sir. You guys will notice the picture. Okay. We weren't given a choice. On a beautiful, sunny summer Sunday morning in August, we were tested. They said he was a monster, heartless and cold, an empty shell of a man. How else could he go into a place of prayer and worship and cold-bloodedly murder everyone in his path? Did he not understand that the only ones that come to temple that early in the morning were the truly selfless and devout? That's right. He was a monster. Before he pumped 5 shots into my father from close range, I wonder if he looked into his eyes. If he would have saw a man who exemplified the great ideals that this nation was built upon. Dedication, charity, hard work, and ultimately sacrifice. At the very least, he would have saw a grandfather who wanted nothing more than to make it home to see his grandson and give him one last piggyback ride. Even monsters understand the importance of piggyback rides. I often wonder how my mother must have felt that day. Mom, when did you know that this monster was loose inside of our temple? Was it after you heard the screams of children running inside? Or was it after you heard gunshots pierce your ears like fireworks on the 4th of July? Did you feel the 5 shots that entered Dad? I was told that lovers can feel each other's pain. So did you feel the one that entered Dad's spine, rendering him unable to walk, bleeding out and helpless? Yeah, I did too. That's probably why it's so hard for us to walk around with our heads held high these days. Some people say that he must have confused Sikhs from Muslims, kind of the way that we confuse people for monsters. But when we judge from a distance, don't we all just generalize? These people are like this, those people are like that. Relying on these generalizations because it's harder to educate ourselves on facts. And even if we are educated, what is it for? So that we can minimize these similarities to justify our wars? War on gangs, war on drugs, war on immigrants, war on terrorists, war on faith, war on the faithless, war on community, war on police, war on hashtags, war with hashtags. Sometimes I think that we're just at war with ourselves. Or do we understand these differences and understand that these are not simply created by God, but created by the very society that we live in? The ingredients we use to make hatred are isolation, suffering, labelization, and minimization. It's no wonder that we resort to name-calling and labelizations. Monsters killing monsters, that was okay, as long as our peaceful neighborhoods weren't burdened by their gunplay. Problem is, as of late, more and more so-called peaceful places, peaceful neighborhoods, sacred spaces, are being burdened by gunplay. Places like malls, theaters, schools, synagogues, mosques, temples, churches, and gurdwaras. And this is exactly what happened on August 5th, 2012, when a white supremacist gunman walked into the Sikh temple of Wisconsin, murdered 5 men, 1 woman, left another man in a vegetative state where he still suffers today, 3 years later, shot a police officer 15 times from close range, leaving him to die before finally turning the gun to himself and taking his own life and ending the siege that day. One of those that would be killed would be my father and temple president, Singh Kaleka. And the question that we're left with is, how do we respond, right? How do we react? To understand our response and our reaction, I think it's important that you understand who we are to this American experience, because it's obvious that the shooter did not. First and foremost, we are Sikhs. Sikhism is a religion founded about 500 years ago by somebody by the name of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. There's about 1 million Sikhs in the United States and Canada alone. 1 million subscribers in the United States and Canada alone. And since the attacks on the World Trade Center, Sikhs, I won't say overwhelmingly, but have been the target of numerous hate crimes in this country, largely due to this outward appearance of turbans and beards. I don't have a turban and beard on today, but I mean a beard, but it's turbans and beards and this post-9/11 paranoia. The word Sikh itself means learner. We believe that we are on this lifelong journey of learning and trying to find out the truth. Truth and God being both synonymous and omnipresent, meaning that you can find truth in God everywhere you look, and everyone you see, and in everything you do. It's everywhere. It's an energy. While truth and God are both synonymous and omnipresent, Sikhs believe in this one creator that created all of us. So the same creator that created you also created you. And we call this creator Ek Onkar. We fully respect, that others might call this creator by different names, right? Secondly, most Sikhs are either first or second generation immigrants. This means that we are relatively new to the American experience. And contrary to the hate rhetoric that's being spewed by people like Donald Trump, when immigrants are given an honest opportunity in a new land, they are genuinely instilled with a sense of productive progress, not only for themselves and their own families, but for the new community they now call home. And I remember this being the case for us as we moved from our native Punjab, which is nestled between Muslim-dominated Pakistan and Hindu-dominated India. And during our move in 1982, that region right there was being engulfed in political turmoil due to a growing call by then people that were Sikh nationalists, who were also labeled Sikh terrorists at the time, but a growing call by them for independence for Punjab. In 1984, in her attempt to squelch this growing uprising, then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered something called Operation Blue Star. Operation Blue Star was an attempt to squelch this growing uprising for independence by capturing Sikh militants or Sikh terrorists, as she labeled it, by any means necessary. Finally, in 1984, she ordered the attack upon the Golden Temple, which for Sikhs is the most holy place, in her attempt to break the backs of Sikhism. Following the atrocities at the Golden Temple, Indira Gandhi herself would be assassinated by her own bodyguards, who were also Sikhs. This touched off years of rioting and opened up a wound in India that some say is still not even healed today. I remember our family, we came in 1982, and I remember us monitoring and mourning these atrocities that were happening in India, especially because many of the people that were being targeted as Sikh nationalists was the Sikh farming community, the traditional Sikh farming community. And my parents were both farmers from a rural village in India, and us looking at this and saying, wow, this is actually happening. However, while we did monitor and mourn these atrocities, we also felt a sense of great reprieve that we were granted this sanctuary and this new homeland that we wanted to make better. Finally, just as important as faith and foundation was family, right? And I remember our family always instilling upon us this notion that you can do anything, you can be anything, and that you can fundamentally change the world. My dad, in this picture, who's the tallest one on there, because his pug is making him taller, but he would start a congregation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and serve as president for 15 years. Found a Gurdwara and built that congregation in that little region into the thousands. My mom, despite only having an 8th grade education, would become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the city of Milwaukee. And my journey would be a little bit different. Being first-generation immigrant and having that cultural clash, right, made it a little bit different. I remember fully my parents working these long nights, these long hours, and oftentimes remember asking them, Mom, Dad, why can't you come to my baseball game? Why can't you come to my football game? Why can't you come to this and that? And their answer would be like, because we have to work. We have to work. We have to work. And I found out really quickly the importance of work ethic, right? So then, when August 5th happened, my history was that I grew up in Milwaukee. I grew up trying to mesh into this new culture, right? I grew up, I went to Marquette, which is a Jesuit school. I'm Sikh, It's kind of weird, but that's just the way it was. That I went off and I became a police officer. I was a police officer for 5 years in the city of Milwaukee, and one of the most crime-riddled areas in Milwaukee. I gave that up after 5 years, and I became a teacher in that same inner city of Milwaukee. And that's when August 5th happened. When I was teaching, I was looking for the sense of, I need to make things better. I need to make these things better. And I remember that always being this driving force in my life. Let's make things better. Probably because our situation had been made better. August 5th started off like any other Sunday morning. My wife had gone off to work. She had to work early. I was getting the kids ready. My daughter was lollygagging, as she usually does. And I was just kind of rushing them because I wanted to get them off to Sunday school. I wanted to get them off to Sunday school so I can go run and do my own errands and chores, right? So my daughter, she's hurrying as much as she can. My son, he gets ready in like 3 minutes flat. But for some reason, my daughter just takes, just longer. Eventually, we get ready and we get into the car and we set off on our way. As we get on the freeway, about 10 minutes into the ride, my daughter looks at me and turns and says, Dad, I forgot something. I'm like, oh, okay. What did you forget? I forgot my little red notebook. And I'm like, now I'm weighing in my mind, does she really need it for Sunday school? It's not really school, is it? But then I started thinking about how strict Sunday school teachers are. And I was like, oh, she better go get it. We better go get it. I said, okay, let's turn around and go get it. We turn around and we go get it, and then all the way back to the house. And this was when gas was like $4 a gallon. All the way back to the house, I'm chastising her and saying, sweetie, you're wasting like $10 worth of gas on this one. We got to go back and get this. We're wasting time. Meanwhile, the only thing I'm thinking in my head is I got to get them dropped off for free babysitting at the Gurdwara so I can go do my chores. Eventually, we get back to the house. She runs inside. She grabs her little red notebooks, comes running out with it in her hand like this. I got it, Dad. I got it. I'm like, okay, cool. We get back on the way, and for like August 5th, the other thing I remember August 5th is just how beautiful the day was. It was just a gorgeous morning. And I remember having my sunroof down. I remember having the windows down and just go, we're on the freeway going like 65, 70 miles per hour, but still, it's just got the windows down. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. Eventually, when we get a little bit closer to the Gurdwara, we started to notice something peculiar. We started to notice that these squad cars are sort of flying around us. Like they're going towards the temple, but they're going around us at like 100 miles per hour. And being a former police officer, I started to think, I'm like, man, what could be that pressing on a Sunday morning like this, that they could be traveling at this rate of speed? Because obviously they're jeopardizing people as they're going. So I just pull over to the side, kind of be careful of the squad cars. And then I started to notice something else that was peculiar. These squad cars were coming from like Brookfield, Waukesha, and all different jurisdictions in that area. And I'm like, this is like this is an all-out call. So I just pull to the side, and then we get off on the freeway, and we get off on the roads. Meanwhile, I go back to my thought of like how beautiful the day was. I'm like, okay, it's fine, everything's fine. And I started looking at the kids in the back, and life was good. We get to the intersection of Rawson and Howell, and this is about a mile away from the Gurdwara. And we notice that it's taped off. Now, I don't know any other way to get to the Gurdwara except for that one road. So I pull over to the side and approach the police officer, and we're the first people there. And ask the police officer, sir, what's going on? Can we get through? And he says, no. There's been a shooting at the temple, and the scene is not secure. And I did one of those like, what? He had told me this. I know what he had just said, but I wanted him to say something different. And then he tells me the same thing. And then this thought goes in my mind. And I don't know why this thought was in my mind. But I remember looking at his uniform. We used to have blue uniforms. He had on his brown uniform that was kind of light brown and dark brown. And I remember thinking to myself, that has got to be the ugliest uniform I have ever seen in my life. I don't know why that was like my thought going on in my head. And now I know that like he was giving me this bad news, and he was going to bear the brunt of my like resentment because he was right there. I didn't say that to him, but I just thought this in my head. And then I went back and I'm like, when did it happen? When did the shooting start?
Just a few minutes.
Yep. And he said like 10 minutes ago. And then I started to think about my daughter, and I started to think about that red notebook. And I start to, like, in one sense, I felt fortunate. And in another sense, my heart was in that temple because I was like, I want to find out what's going on with Mom, what's going on with Dad. And they were both there, right? And I remember that day touching off just a day of feeling completely helpless, completely vulnerable, completely hopeless, right? As the day went, I started to find out more details about what was going on inside the temple and the prayers that were being had. And then something miraculous happened. Outside of this temple, at the time of the shooting, around 10 o'clock, 10:30, 11 o'clock, there was about 10 people, 20 people gathered. And all of a sudden, come 12 o'clock, there's about 100 people gathered. And then come around 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, thousands of people outside of this temple praying and showing up and being present. Wade Page that day had tried to come in and divide a community by the actions that he committed. With faith, foundation, family, anything is possible. And our family that day was no longer just a Sikh community. Our family that day had become the broader community. And this is what Wade Page did. The organization that we started after that day is called Serve to Unite. And it is in defiance of what Wade Page tried to do, trying to divide us. In Milwaukee, we try to unite communities by any means necessary. And we do it with the basic principle of Sikhi, Chardi Kala. Now, a lot of times, you just hear Chardi Kala, right? You don't hear the full saying. I'm going to tell you the full saying today. Nanak naam Chardi Kala, tere bane sarbatta pala. And what that basically means is in the spirit of the highest, whatever you call the highest, spirit of the supreme, we shall be relentlessly optimistic. Now, I'm not going to say that this happened overnight for us. Our community, we still were hurting, we still were grieving. Me, myself, I was still grieving, right? This is 3 years later. But we now understand how important this is in taking power back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pardeep. I'd like now to invite our other visitors to come to the table. Faatimah Knight and Molly Horan. Faatimah Knight is pursuing an MA in Religious Studies at the Chicago Theological Seminary and holds a BA in Islamic Law and Theology from Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. She spearheaded the project Respond with Love, Rebuild Black Churches, Support Victims of Arson Across the South, where her team raised $100,000 for black churches that had been victims of arson following the murders at the AME Church in Charleston. Faatimah serves as a member of the Lamppost Education Initiative's Board of Directors and is the Religion Section Editor for Sapilo Square, an online resource for African American Islam. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Faatimah Knight. You have to put this on.
Hi, hello everyone. Let me apologize for being late, first of all. I got very turned around, but alhamdulillah, I arrived. So first, I want to thank the Parliament for inviting me here today. I'm grateful to be able to contribute, and I pray that God makes me of benefit to others and that I benefit as well, which I already have from the presentation. So this panel is about protecting sacred spaces, specifically churches, mosques, and temples. I'm primarily going to talk about the protection of churches in the United States, particularly black churches in the South. I'll do so through the lens of my recent work with 4 southern churches: Briar Creek Road Baptist Church in North Carolina, God's Power Church of Christ in Georgia, Glover Baptist Church in South Carolina, and College Hill Church in Tennessee. I came to have knowledge of these 4 churches over the summer when they were burned down by arsonists, all within a few days of each other. So I want to briefly introduce you to the initiative that I started along with some friends, and it's going to be brief on account of the clarity of that vision. It had a very particular goal. So the initiative, called Rebuild with Love, had 3 parts. 1, to raise awareness of the hate crimes that had been committed. 2, to raise money from within the Muslim community in order to help the churches rebuild. And 3, to develop a connection with these churches built on a foundation of goodwill. So I want to talk a bit about the act of burning black churches. Before I say more about the initiative itself, I'd like to speak to the history of targeting black churches. We should keep in mind that attacks on black churches are a very old form of intimidation, in the South especially, historically used to strike fear into the hearts of black people. So its results are both physical damage to the church itself, and also psychological damage because of the harm it causes to the community. Although it's true that arson at religious institutions has decreased over the decades, attacks on black churches today are a haunting reminder of what used to be a norm. And the fact that almost immediately when a black church is burned down, before investigators can conclude that the cause was arson, many black people make that conclusion for themselves, which speaks to a very real anxiety under the surface that many members of the black community carry with them. So the first burning of a black church on record occurred in 1822 in South Carolina. What's immediately remarkable about this fact is the date 1822, which is 40 years before emancipation. So we're talking about terror on top of terror. So the terror of burning a church on top of the already present terror of being enslaved. One of the most well-known attacks on black churches throughout American history was the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which killed 4 girls and injured at least 14 others. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave the eulogy for those 4 young victims. He said about them that day, "They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity." I find there is great bitter irony in burning black churches when one considers that Christianity is the religion that so many Africans enslaved in the Americas were forced to practice. It is an act that speaks so clearly to the depravity of the people committing it, people who undoubtedly call themselves Christians as well. To give just one example out of tons, St. John Baptist Church in South Carolina had been attacked by racists during the eras of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, segregation, civil rights, and then burned down 3 times after that. During church services in 1983, a group of whites shot out the windows of that church, wrote KKK on the church door, and defecated on the sacrament cloth. Now you have to wonder what kind of cognitive dissonance, loathing of the other, and indeed self-loathing could cause someone who calls himself Christian to defecate on the sacrament cloth of a church just because it's a black church. The act of burning black churches is emblematic of the very difficult position black people have historically been in. The tenuousness, the fact of living in between a rock and a hard place. The church is standard infrastructure in so many black communities. It stands tall. So attacking it is akin to attacking its people. Breaking it down is akin to breaking the backs of its people. So again, this is symbolic of the condition of black people historically, forced to exist in this land, but criminalized or brutalized for trying to create a life worth living in this land. A church is a community's attempt to strike roots in the ground, which seems benign enough, but the black church has continually come into conflict because certain segments of society only want black people to live tangentially, on the surface and in a state of anxiety. The church, when it's at its best, is a bed of ideas, a hub of learning, a center out of which thought spreads outward and through the community, a place to reaffirm one's humanity and worth before God. So when there are people who are uncomfortable with black people finding permanence, then attacking a center of spirit and culture like the church makes total sense. We can find a striking example of this in the life of Malcolm X. Though he converted to Islam, he grew up a Christian, with a father who was a Baptist preacher. Malcolm's family had to leave their home because of being attacked by a band of whites who knew that Malcolm's father was a Christian preacher, living there with his wife and children. But Malcolm's father wasn't preaching a pie-in-the-sky, passive kind of religion. Not that that would have necessarily helped. Instead, he was preaching Christianity with a heavy dose of Marcus Garvey black pride, straighten your back, determine your future. And as we know, Malcolm's father was killed by the KKK. Malcolm's mother, Louise, suffered a mental breakdown and was sent to a mental institution. So these two things really come together. Attacking religious life, here in the form of killing a preacher, and causing psychological damage and anxiety. And this is one example of something that has been a hallmark of the black experience in America, unfortunately. Now, what's interesting and perhaps unique about the burning of black churches in America is that the perpetrators of these crimes are people who would likely identify as Christians themselves. So this is actually a kind of strange Christian-on-Christian violence. That's one way of looking at it. In other countries, we might tend to see people of different faiths at odds with each other, or one religious group aggressing against another religious group. However, in this country historically, white-on-black hate crimes can usually be viewed as Christian-on-Christian hate crimes, because both parties are indeed Christian. I think this is important to acknowledge because we don't tend to think of ourselves as a country that has religious violence. In fact, religious freedom is at the center of how we tell the story about ourselves. But the forced conversion of native populations in the West to Christianity is religious violence. The forced conversion of enslaved Africans was not an act of religious violence simply because white Americans were aggressive with proselytizing, which they were, but more so because the penalty for not pledging Jesus as your Lord and Savior could mean the physical harm could come to you, or even death. And that threat never really went away. It just morphed so that if blacks didn't preach or testify to the kind of feel-good Christianity they were taught, if they didn't practice a humility that was more along the lines of despondency, if they didn't love their oppressors, there was, again, fear of retribution. So even people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were sometimes criticized for not being quite Christian enough, which was really just code for not sitting back and taking your oppression. So to reiterate, attacks on black churches are an indication of the fragility of black life, the fear of being cut down. It creates an anxiety atop the already present constitutional anxiety of just being a human being. Now, after that long sketch of some of the history of church burnings, let me return to the present. 1 week after the mass shooting at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, at least 4 black churches were burned down by arsonists. The shooting at the church shook the nation, as it rightfully should have, from our comatose state, and denied us the right to wax nostalgic about days of violent racism in this country that we thought were over. Given the horrific event that happened at Emmanuel AME in Charleston, one would think that other such attacks on black life and black religion would be lifted up and given due attention. But it wasn't popular news at all. It was, however, being spoken about with focus on social media with the hashtag #WhoIsBurningBlackChurches. This lack of attention was so frustrating for me and many others because even when crimes and acts of aggression have a pattern, they are treated like one-time incidents, disconnected. And people are told they are crazy for trying to connect the dots. It means that we don't talk about and seek to address underlying issues because we don't see underlying issues. We see one-time events that are sad, yes, but not reflective of elements within our own society. The campaign that my team started, Rebuild with Love, was driven by the principle that all houses of worship are sacred and the oft-quoted, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." We wanted to send a strong message of support and to stand up against hate. We know that fear can be devastating and crippling, and that even if someone can dust themselves off from hate, it doesn't mean that feeling of having been targeted or violated will permanently go away. We wanted to contribute to dissipating that fear that those congregations could be feeling by extending a helping hand they didn't anticipate reaching out to them. We also wanted to make very clear that the deep connections between the black community and the Muslim community, and that 1/3 of American Muslims are black, and in that up to 20% of Africans brought to the Americas to be slaves were Muslim. We wanted to take that message and present it to the Muslim community and say, listen, this is our problem too. So in the end, we raised enough money to send a check of $24,000 to each of the churches. We're not only called upon to speak truth to power, I think, but to speak truth to fear as well, and to speak truth to despair. We hope through our initiative that we were able to do a bit of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faatimah and Pardeep, for your very moving stories. And for, can you hear me? I think it's on the wrong side. Is this better? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Pardeep and Faatimah, for your very moving stories. And what you have done to turn things around, and what has been many a times a loving response to the fear that, in Pardeep's case, your community has opened, and you are doing things you never dreamed you would be doing for the good. Yeah. And Faatimah as well, thank you so much. What you are both doing in your own circumstances. I'd like to tell a short story of my own before I introduce Molly to organize the question and answer session here. Mine has to do with the Oklahoma bombings. I have nieces who live in Oklahoma City who almost walked into that building at 9 o'clock and luckily didn't. But they were very, very moved by what happened there. I visited them a couple of times. One recently, after the attack had happened, the bombing, to see all of the expressions and outpourings of love and care for those people who had died, with all kinds of things on the fences, pictures of loved ones who had died and flowers and this kind of thing. Well, I came back 2 years later after the memorial had been built. And I noticed that there was a church on one corner and one on the other corner with the bombing block in the center. One was a Roman Catholic church and one was a Methodist church. So I went to see what happened to these churches, to their congregations, as a result of this attack, the bombing of Oklahoma City's federal building. So I walked over to the Roman Catholic Church, and there was no one there. There was no way to get in. It was fenced off. There was no way to make contact. I even called, and there was no answer. So that was one response. Then I went to the Methodist Church, which actually had been damaged, and they were open. I walked in and asked them, I told them who I was. I did studies on sacred spaces, and I wanted to know what happened here with their church and with their congregation. So they were wonderful. They called up the oldest member of the congregation to come immediately over there and give me a 2-hour tour and tell me everything. And this church happened to be in harm's way. The Catholic Church was not damaged at all, but this one was in harm's way. It had been damaged. The police line was outside it, so these people could not worship there after this happened. And the church space was used to hold dead bodies until they were taken other places. So their church did serve, a purpose in that, the aftermath. It was damaged, so what's this congregation going to do? Well, they were first invited to a school across the street, and they worshiped there. But then there was a Baptist church that had a large space and a small congregation. And so they invited the entire congregation to worship with them, which was a great mix of these two situations. This Baptist church could not afford this huge place, and the other group needed a place to worship. So for 3 years, they worshiped together, while the original church was reconstructed and a new sanctuary built. So included in that new structure was a full immersion baptismal font, which is only seen in Baptist churches, and now it's in the Methodist church in the front. And this is such a very wonderful outcome of a terrible situation as well. So now I want to introduce Molly Horan, and she's on the staff at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago. Wait till I find her description here to give her proper acknowledgement. Molly Horan is Director of Communications for the Parliament of the World's Religions. She joined the global organization in 2012, coordinating its Faith Against Hate campaign, mobilizing action to stem the rising hate in the United States through strategic partnerships, producing webinars, events, and creating advocacy media for the interfaith movement. Before delving into social justice work, she's trained in media and public affairs with the British Consulate of Chicago, Ireland's Houses of Parliament, Marin Corporation Productions, and the Tribune Company. She graduated with highest honors from DePaul University in journalism and Irish studies. I'm pleased to introduce to you Molly Horan.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Okay, hi. Well, thank you, Suzanne. I have to mention Suzanne is a great friend of the Parliament. We see each other often, and she greatly inspired me to come to the Parliament and work with her ideas about us doing more advocacy about the rising hate. So I didn't prepare anything today. I wanted to listen, and I wanted to hear from you. You're the reason I'm here, but they're also the reason that I'm here. As Pardeep and Faatimah were speaking, I was thinking, should I speak more about experience, or should I speak more about society? And what I noticed is that I remember when I first learned about what happened in Oak Creek, everyone kept saying, this is the worst attack against a house of worship since the Birmingham bomb. And then when the shooting happened in Charleston, everyone was saying, this is the worst attack against a house of faith since the Sikh temple shooting. And that was just this summer. And we're here at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and we're in a giant room with a lot of empty seats. But we're going to be talking a lot about these issues in the next 5 days. They're great to come here and tell us their stories. We hear them through the media. This is a really great opportunity. Pardeep and Faatimah are also going to be speaking in plenary sessions. But this is your chance to step forward and ask them questions about what you can do. What I found, not being a professional hate crime extinguisher, there's no such thing, is that you have to throw your heart behind what you're doing. And you have to keep your eyes open and your ears open. Where I live, I come from a pretty diverse suburb outside of Chicago. It's become more diverse since I grew up. When I was young, it wasn't very diverse. And in the surrounding areas, just in the last several months, there was a mosque that had been shot into the ceiling with a bullet. Nobody could prove where it came from or whether or not it was a hate crime, but of course it had to be guarded and secured for a number of days. A Sikh man was beaten on his way to a grocery store not too long ago because he was Sikh and he was wearing a turban and a beard, and a young person didn't know he wasn't Muslim and also didn't know it's not okay to hate Muslims. There's a lot of rage in young people who are misunderstanding society, that this is a very diverse country, and don't understand that this is supposed to be a safe space for all. Beyond that, I live beside a grocery store, and in a strange collision of relationships, an African-American friend of mine, grandmother, was stabbed in the back in the grocery store behind my house by the younger brother of a Russian family that immigrated to my neighborhood when I was young. And I'm sitting witness to all these events while I'm working at the biggest interfaith organization in the world, trying to challenge these issues, and I'm a person looking at this saying, what can I do? I have Facebook, I have Twitter. When these events happen around the world, I try to highlight people who have come from one side of a quote, division to help the other side. So if there's an attack on mosques in the Central African Republic, I look for the photo of the Christians that are holding hands and they're standing around those mosques and saying, if you're going to come and hurt this mosque, you have to come through me. When I find a picture like that and I put it on the Parliament's Facebook page, it gets a lot more traction than anything else we post, because that's what's in people's hearts. They want to have the bravery and the courage to stand up, but not in every community is it such a life or death situation. But what we've learned here is that it actually is. We just don't know when. So what can we do? We're seeing hate rising. We have to also see love rise. And I think the best job that we can do is we can drown out the hate with love. And that is by filling a room like this. Let's have a parliament next year and the year after and fill a room like this and see the connection, because we have a Black Lives Matter movement, we have a movement against hate, but these are all coming together. The reason that we even know this year that there are a certain number of hate crimes against the Sikh community, and it's only a small number that have been reported and tracked, is because a coalition of about 190 organizations that represented Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and South Asians came together and said, hey, US government, why aren't you counting attacks against us? We're not just other. You need to know what's going on in this country if we're going to do anything about it. And this is just what's happening in the United States. We're welcoming the world to the United States. And what we saw in the case of Pardeep's family, the Gurdwara hadn't been built for very long, and it was mostly built by people who came to this country. And the stories that reached India, where they came from, are becoming all too common. They come to the American dream, and it becomes an American nightmare. So if we're here as Americans, or if we're here as citizens around the world, we have to say no. We have to say no. And how are we going to do that? By showing up together in public, by taking pictures with each other, by getting to know each other and making events like this much, much more visible. So I encourage you to tweet every 30 minutes while you're here a photo of yourself with someone who looks very different from you, what their name is, and why you enjoyed meeting them. Do that while you're here. And then for the next little while, I'd like just you to take an opportunity to talk to Faatimah and talk to Pardeep and to talk to Suzanne, who is a huge part of why this parliament is happening today. So if anyone has any questions, otherwise we can adjourn. Yes?
Sure.
You could dance,
We
you
can
can
hear
sing.
I mean, I arrived late actually, and part of the reason I arrived late is because the room got changed.
Yes.
I was hoping, as I came here, that the reason the room had been changed was to give you more space because you were going to need it.
Well, we're so early. We're very tired. People are still sleeping.
And actually, like you, I am sad that there aren't more people here to listen to this, but I found it quite very powerful. It wasn't quite what I expected, which is interesting, but I still found what I heard very powerful. I suppose why it wasn't what quite I expected, but I actually find it rather sad. And what do they say about the meeting and the parliament, that there aren't more people.
Well, I could speak to that. Number one,
Excuse me. Molly, could you repeat the question because our
live stream didn't
recorders
hear it. Yeah.
can't hear it?
Okay, thank you very much. So what I heard is the room got changed, and she was hoping that it's because there were so many people we needed to move to a larger room. And she came up and she was sad that the room wasn't so full, but she was actually very interested in what she heard from the panelists. And if you put me onto a stage, I'm going to try and humanize the experience as much as possible, because you're going to hear a lot of facts and figures. I actually, as a parliament representative, can tell you why the room is not so full. It's on the 3rd floor, number one. It's early in the morning, number two. And a good reason, number three, is that we have a lot of famous people at this parliament. We have a lot of famous people speaking at this parliament, which means we've done a good job of making some of these stories visible. So there are a lot of sessions going on right now. So there's going to be a lot of rooms that might be this size. But if we tweet and we get people here. We have nearly 10,000 people at the parliament, and they're going to hear from Pardeep and Faatimah in a plenary session later. You're in Emerging Leaders? Mm-hmm. Yeah, tonight. Mm-hmm. So they're going to have an audience of 10,000.
I would encourage you, if you do get a chance, Sunday night, I think it's 5:15. Yeah. We'll be showing the documentary Not in Our Town, Waking in Oak Creek. Yeah. And we'll be part of that and a couple other sessions. But I mean, as far as like thinking about it broadly and thinking about the role that faith plays in America, I think we have to understand that, and I understood this after August 5th, so don't let me say, hey, you know what, I understood this before then. I wasn't really into faith that much, and I'll just be quite honest. It never appealed to me as a boy. My parents would tell me these things, and obviously, like, Chardi Kala became one of those things. We say that every single day, but I didn't know the importance of it until you need it. So sometimes what we do is we are seed planters, and we plant seeds, and it you know, somebody else nourishes it, and then it takes root, right? And I would encourage you and anybody else, you know, what we're going to be speaking to the choir, essentially. These are all believers. And one of the conversations that I had on the way here is like, somebody asked me, do you really think that faith can do anything about hate? And I was like, I don't know, you're speaking to the wrong person. Like, I genuinely believe prayer combined with purpose can be powerful and can change anything, right? But we have to understand that other people don't think that. So a lot of times I talk about Nanak And I talk about when Nanak was starting his practice. Guru Nanak is our first guru. When he started to try to like eliminate superstitions and injustices that were happening. And he basically walked around town with a Muslim priest and a Hindu priest because there was no Sikhism at the time. And as he walked from Afghanistan to Tibet to Sri Lanka to Iran to China. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to walk. We're going to have to go to people. And that's just essentially the crux of what we have to do. Yes?
I really haven't got the point to my question yet.
Oh, okay.
When I said that this isn't quite what I expected, what I meant by that was that the way it was described in the program made me think that it was going to be much more international. And it is a focus on America. And for me, that's interesting because I spend my professional life, I work for World Council of Churches in interreligious relations, worrying about religious violence in many parts of the world. So it isn't, so the topic isn't new to me, and it's something I care about very much. But we don't hear that much. We don't hear that much about religious violence in America. So it's actually quite interesting. But what I'm wrestling with is what is the sort of the question of the interface between the religious violence in America and the situations that we've heard of here this morning, and religious violence in other parts of the world. How do they impact each other? Do they, in a kind of way, enter into a kind of vicious spiral? That what goes on in other parts of the world impacts upon the US, what goes on in the US impacts upon other parts of the world.
So I'm going to repeat the question. So you're asking what basically the relationship is, how hate and anger and violence in the U.S. and hate and anger and violence and conflict outside the U.S. internationally relate to one another. For sure. Absolutely. And can I ask, would you like to give your name or? Claire Amos, and you're working with the World Council of Churches? Yes, okay. Well, what I've learned, and I'll ask if one of you want to weigh in. Okay. What I've learned, and directly from the chair of the board of the parliament, who you heard last night, is that fear, hate, and anger are all interconnected. And what we see in the outside world contributes to a culture of fear here in the United States. So I would say that it's exactly as you describe. It's a very vicious cycle. And the fact that here in the United States we have a media that basically demonizes religions in other countries. Yeah, I'm going to leave out whether or not there's an agenda there, but when I travel to the UK and I watch the news on Syria, it's very different than the news on Syria that I've seen in the United States for the past 3 years. In other parts of the world, it's a crisis of how we can help. And here in the United States, it's often not portrayed that way. It's a crisis of what's coming through our borders. And that's not unique to the United States. There are a lot of countries throughout the world that are experiencing issues like that. And I don't know. I mean, when things relate like that, you want to make a comment. When things relate like that, when there's a constant stream of violence and fears bring up, it's hard not to believe that interreligious conflict isn't something that the world will always be dealing with. But I think we're going to hit a fever pitch here. We're seeing things are getting more and more frequent. If you think of a storm, you think of thunder. The thunder picks up, but it gets faster and faster before the storm hits. And we're facing that crisis. That's part of the reason why we call it the Parliament of the World's Religions, so we have an opportunity to discuss these things. So we're not discussing it as experts so much as we are invested citizens who want to come and engage and share. So I encourage you to offer your perspective, and if anyone else has any comments, I encourage you.
Excuse me. If you'd like to talk some more, you need to come up here so that it is recorded properly.
That's okay.
Thanks. What we are taking in America as a case example, it's a testimony for the whole world. What's happening outside in different countries, different parts of the world, look at Asia right now. They're struggling, especially in India right now. There's a lot of riots over there. There's a faith-based riots happening. Look at Middle Eastern countries. There's terrorism over there. Look at Europe right now. A few months back, we had a Muslim magazine which was bombed in France. What you can say about those attacks regularly happening, not just in America, in the whole part of the world. We need awareness. That's what Mali said. That's what Pardeep, that's what everyone said over here. Faatimah said, that's love should be rising. Love is all the way. It's in every country. That's the numbers, definitely numbers matter a lot. But numbers over here, these 20 people, 25, 30 people who are here right now, we all can sow the seeds through social media, through personal talks. And we can change, as Pardeep said, that we are talking to the choir to each other. But where we can make a difference is talking to people outside. What Mai said, we have to tweet, because tweeting is hammering people's mindset. That's what we need at this point in time. We need to hammer people's mindset to change their ideology. At some more time, when we keep on hammering them, they will break. They will turn to soft hearts. So that's my perspective. That's my 2 cents, that we should look at America as a case example, but look at a broader perspective and learn something out of it.
And I'm gonna ask Suzanne to weigh in one moment, and I just want to bring something up that Raul reminded me of, and that is, it's not just interfaith activists, but faith leaders. There's a lot of encouragement by the interfaith movement to get faith leaders to step outside of their houses of worship into the community. And we've been tracking, we've been measuring, we've been looking at the ways that faith leaders and religious communities bring a positive impact in their community. And we have a reporter here from Forbes wandering in the parliament. I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to meet him, but he did a profile of one of our major speakers, K.R. Ravindran, who is the head of Rotary International, talking about the impact that religious cooperation can have in the world. And I encourage you to read that article. But we have to show what religion contributes to the world so that people understand that it's not just something funny that makes us different from each other, that we're actually invested. We live here. This is a planet that we share. And I'm not trying to say these as platitudes. I'm saying when Hurricane Katrina hit, religious communities from all sorts of denominations came together and fed and rescued and housed and restored and rebuilt. This, the efforts of the community in the immediate sense was all hands on deck, but in the long-term sense, it's been faith communities picking up the pieces. And so we're trying to move interfaith away from being a dialogue about what your God looks like and what my God thinks, and, oh no, I don't have a God, do I belong in this room? It's like, no, we have a climate crisis, and we have wars that are raging, and we're trying to make sense of them because they might be happening far away. But as I was trying to point out, whether or not it's a large-scale genocide or something that could pop up in your community at any time, we want to prevent these things from happening. And that's what I conceive of protecting sacred spaces. And I think that that's applicable to a neighborhood in the United States, and it's applicable to a village in India, and it's applicable to a commune somewhere, out in the boonies somewhere, where we don't even have a name for the religion, but we'll meet them here. So great that you made that comment. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I think that's a point of discussion we should carry forward. Suzanne?
I'd like to advertise a couple of programs you might want to go to in relation to what we've been discussing. And one of them is, I'd like to introduce Tija Chaucevic, who's here from Bosnia, and she will be doing a presentation called Dream or Reality, 20 Years of the Peace-Building Process in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So please stand up. And her presentation is Saturday, 3:30 to 5 p.m. So she'll bring an international perspective. And I have two presentations I'm making. One of them is called Sharing Sacred Spaces. That'll be this afternoon, and that's about creating interreligious communities in cities around the world. It's a pilot project, and we intend to take it to cities around the world. The other one I'm doing is also international, and it is called The Architecture of Faith, a global interreligious pilgrimage, where I take people to the origins geographically of 12 of the world's religions and show a piece of architecture that describes that faith. So I invite you to come to those three. Thank you.
Do you have questions? Hi. Would you like to come up so that the room can hear? Sure. Then you. Okay. Welcome.
Hey, my name's Carolyn. I'm here with a group from Jewish Voice for Peace. And I was really appreciating, Faatimah, in your talk, how you were connecting these individual acts of terrorism and violence to larger structural problems that we have in our country and in our world. And I was wondering how, when we go about organizing our communities to respond to these actions, which can be seen as such individual hateful actions, how we do that organizing in a way so we can really bring our communities to addressing larger structural issues.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. Well, you know, what I did with my small, modest initiative was to really focus my community on, you know, 4 very specific churches, 4 congregations, and I think to also help the Muslim community connect the dots and see why this is something that they should care about. So see that, you know, like I said in the talk, that 1/3 of American Muslims are black, which means that pretty much all of those black Muslims have Christian family members who go to congregations just like the ones that were attacked. So I think helping people to see those interconnections and see why they should be invested is really important, and see themselves as a part of a larger historical narrative. And so I think focusing people's attention on very specific things, because I mean, you know, even to address, you know, these larger systemic issues, you really still have to focus, right? There's really no way to just address the underlying problem, you know, unfortunately, but you have to address the ways in which it manifests itself in society and try to, like Molly said, really stamp down and prevent these individual acts, and to call people out, and, you know, call people out for not reporting on things, call people out for not caring or for treating things in an inappropriate manner. So for treating the church burnings as if they happen in isolation, as if they're not a part of a larger problem in which, you know, there have probably been over 1,000 black churches that have been burned down in the course of our history since before emancipation, which is crazy. So I think those things, that, you know, showing people the interconnectedness of their community with other communities, and trying to mobilize people around very specific initiatives. Do you want to say something to that?
Oh, thank you. Great job. And you had a question.
While you're coming up, come on up. I just want to take a second to introduce our moderator, who's been so good, Suzanne. Suzanne Morgan, a practicing architect for 25 years since the events of September 11th, 2001 in New York City, has devoted her career to educating people about the world's religions through architecture. She has done this through tours and open houses of a wide diversity of religious traditions. In addition, Suzanne has developed a collection of commissioned architectural models of existing religious structures that include interior views of sanctuaries, along with their spatial arrangement of religious elements. So if you'd like to talk to Suzanne, she's very approachable and very, very smart. So come on up.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Heather Griffin. I'm a minister of the Uniting Church in Australia and involved with the interfaith work both at our synod level and at our assembly level, which was the Australia-wide version. We in Australia have, of course, similar but different issues to the US. We have our own perspectives. I feel personally that my own calling by God is to work within my own denomination, to work on the issues of fear, the issues, reason I've come to ask a question now is because of events that are happening in Australia, and so I thought I might share, I will be very brief, I promise, 2 stories very briefly, and ask your wisdom, because I think that often as we work in that working against hate, there are constantly events that increase it again, constantly. And for one, I just get to the point of thinking, I feel exhausted. I just keep on going. But anyway, two very quick stories. In Australia, in the last couple of weeks, a policeman in Sydney, in Parramatta, was shot by a 15-year-old young Muslim. Very sad situation. The local mosque reacted beautifully, wonderfully, wise words that came from there. But nevertheless, within my own communities, of course, those who are saying we shouldn't have Muslims in the country immediately say, look at what we just said. Second, within my own community, the Uniting Church, we have good stories and bad stories. We have one congregation in the middle of Queensland that shares its worship areas with a local Muslim group and have developed very good relationships. We've also, and this is the crux of my question really, we had another very sad story last week where on both the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, if you know Queensland at all, both tourist areas, both beautiful beaches, all of that sort of stuff. People, well, on the Gold Coast there is a mosque. On the Sunshine Coast they're trying to build a mosque and facing all sorts of opposition. On the Gold Coast, the Uniting Church, the mosque was having problems with parking. So the Uniting Church minister got the imam to come along to the church council. They discussed offering parking, the Uniting Church facilities for the mosque. The church council agreed. It was all going smoothly, and then they took it to the congregation as a whole. The congregation, the fear element took over. One of my favourite verses in the whole Bible actually is perfect love casts out fear. But the fear element took over. Some of the people in the congregation stood up and said, if it's known that the Uniting Church is aligning itself with the mosque, our houses will be burnt down. And you just can't imagine the fear that can be so easily generated. So my quick question is, wisdom all around for both encouragement in terms of keeping on, and wisdom to diffuse the fear. How do we diffuse fear?
First, let me talk about that feeling of exhaustion. I think when you're doing this work and you're conscious of everything that's going around and these atrocities that are happening everywhere, you do get exhausted. But it's a purposeful exhaustion, so you can keep on. And just like Faatimah said, all this fear is dispelled relationship by relationship. You know, we sometimes see we view the world through media, mass media, and it does tell us of the Muslim who killed the police officer, or something else that happens when a person does something bad to somebody else, and it becomes big news. We don't hear about the 99.9% of people that are doing great work, right? Because that gets taken for granted, and that's an unfortunate scenario that we're at. We need to be the people that change the rhetoric around it, the narrative around it, and we need to reach out and reach out to people whom we might feel uncomfortable with, and that's what dispelling fear looks like. Being courageous. I don't know how many former white supremacists I've talked to. I don't know how many people that are still involved in the movement that I've talked to. I was scared. I was fearful, right? When you're reaching out to people who killed essentially your father and attacked your community, it's not the easiest thing to go out and say, hey, you know what? I forgive you. Forgiveness shouldn't be seen as a sign of weakness. Forgiveness and compassion are signs of strength. It is you saying that you don't hold any power over me. And so we need to be a forgiving society. We need to be a compassionate society. And most important, we need to be a courageous society. And so I would say, just in your personal relationships, be courageous and encourage other people to be courageous. I know everybody's courageous in here, but we're going to have to encourage those that don't want to get out and meet somebody and have that interpersonal relationship. Do it. Do it.
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful response. And I'll just add quickly that I think it's also important to bring out the facts in situations, right? So I don't know about Australia, but I mean, at least in America, most, in terms of the various races, or at least if we just look at, white Americans and black Americans, white Americans kill each other at pretty much the same rates that black Americans kill each other, right? But we tend to have, that's not the way that the media likes to portray things, right? It likes to portray people of seemingly opposite persuasions or, races or cultures, having it at each other, or one aggressing upon another. And it doesn't really lift up the truth, which is that, in reality, people usually hurt those who are closest to them, and that happens racially as well. So, in terms of murders of black people, yeah, it's mostly black people who are the murderers, and in terms of murders of white people, it's mostly whites who are the murderers. And that's not to say or to ignore when there are hate crimes, one group aggressing against another, but it's to say that, we can't be so, just to kind of wake people up from their delusions about it being some group over there who's always trying to harm them, when so much of the harm that happens in communities is from within those communities. So just to kind of bring people back to earth a little bit, and still acknowledge that there might be hateful people who want to come in from outside, is obviously there are, I'm not denying that. And of course, in the case of the Sikh temple, obviously there are people who are from outside the community who want to cause harm, and in the case of the black churches, people from outside the community who want to cause harm. But we also have to be balanced, right, and try to dispel some of the more ignorant fear that people tend to have.
Okay, so I just want to be mindful of the time. We have 5 minutes left, and we have about 3 or 4 people who would like to speak. So
I don't have anything to...
well, there'll be So what I suggest is our panelists are happy to continue the conversation. If you have something really very, very pressing you want the room to hear, I can take your question. But we have to start saying thank you for coming here, and not to be discouraged, because we're having so many sessions on this topic. It's one of the major tracks of the Parliament, so there's lots of programs going on with perspectives on this issue right now. Welcome.
I am always hearing about forgiveness, love, etc. What about hearing from somebody, I'm sorry? Nobody's admitting to this hatred and these hateful acts, but we're always told, forgive, but nobody says, I'm sorry. So does forgiveness work when nobody says, I'm sorry?
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point. Well, I think forgiveness still works in the sense that it can be healing for the self, just as a way of moving forward. But Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we tend to, for with the justice system, right? So oftentimes when people try to have conversations about the inequalities in the justice system, so in the ways that minorities are unfairly targeted, as opposed to whites who do similar crimes, then you might have someone say, well, why are these black people or these minorities committing these crimes in the first place, right? So kind of deflecting from the issue at hand. But that question is not appropriate to talking about the justice system, right? Because justice is justice. So don't talk about, well, why are people doing what they're doing? No, we say, okay, if people commit similar crimes, then they should be tried in the same way. And so I think it's important to acknowledge where these kind of more spiritual and moral, things have their place. So things like, forgiveness and, they have their place, but we still have to let justice be justice, right? And I think we can never ignore that. And I think forgiveness is for the victims. But I think you should speak to that too.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think sorry for me, that day when it happened, the shooter shot himself after he shot everybody else and after he left everybody for dead. He took his own life. And so from him, I was physically not going to get a sorry. And so that was the reality. And then, we talk about forgiveness and compassion, but on that way, that ride home, I remember being alone in my car and screaming because I felt vulnerable and I felt violated and I felt like our community felt violated. And I felt there were so many injustices stemming from law enforcement not responding the way we wanted them to do, not giving us the information we needed, not answering the questions we wanted. And I started to feel all these internal resentment of marginalization, right? Like if this was a white church, right? And if this was somebody else that attacked it, would those people be safe? Would those people be alive? Would it have not took so long to get inside and help those bleeding people, right? And so I remember feeling that. And then I said to myself, I don't need your sorry, because for one, that's a shift of power. That's, for me, I'm not going to give you the ability to be sorry. You're going to be sorry, right? White supremacist ideology rests on a 14-word mantra. The 14-word mantra on white supremacist ideology is, we shall ensure the existence of our race and the future for white children. This is what every white supremacist believes and thinks that they're doing. And I said to myself, you're going to be sorry, but not the way that traditional sorries were. And so it was important for us to say, okay, now we were self-segregated before. Sikhs were generally just in our own little bubble, speaking to our own people in our own languages, eating our own foods, and not being advocates in the community. And I said, now you're going to be sorry, because all these people are going to get involved in the broader community. And now we're going to have Sikhs who are going to be police officers and politicians and teachers and this and that. And that's exactly what happened. So it's up to us to make, and I hate to say this and them because I hate the them argument, but to make them sorry. Great question, though.
Thank you, Pardeep. Can I get a round of applause? You can see both Pardeep, Kaleka, and Faatimah Knight in the Emerging Leaders Plenary tonight, and I especially encourage all of you over the age of 40 to be there. This Parliament really, really, really wants intergenerational conversations taking place. We don't want the young people and the older people operating in silos. We want to inspire and motivate one another. So I've been encouraged to encourage you to do that. And if you'd like to speak to them, maybe they can hang out in the back of the room for a little while. But thank you.
Thank
keep in
you
touch
so
with
much.
me.
Yes.
Thank you.
Keep in touch with me, Molly, at parliamentofreligions.org. And please tweet hashtag 2015 Parliament or hashtag Faith in Women.
Sat Sri Akal. you.